Call to order the short-term rental task force meeting on May 18th, 2023. Clerk will call the roll.
Here.
Here.
Hart.
Here.
Clark.
Here.
Here.
McDowell.
Here.
Morella.
Here.
Steele.
Here.
Steve.
Here.
Hickenlooper.
Great, thanks. Start with approval of the agenda. Need a motion for that?
I move to approve the agenda for May 18th.
Second?
Second.
Okay, approval by Stanton, second by Mann. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Approval of the minutes. A motion to approve?
Make a motion to approve the minutes from May 4th, 2023.
Second,
Second.
second Tringali. All in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any comments on the minutes? Okay. Now we're getting to the first public comment period. So we'll open up for 3-minute comments on anything related to the agenda. So that's the short-term rental registration process, the existing ordinances, community comparison options, or future topics. Start with the room. Anybody have any comments in the room?
Good afternoon, Mark Klungel, 747 Water Street, Saugatuck resident. I have a question on just process at this point. The short-term rental task force was built to identify the problems. And now we're looking at ordinances. But we haven't really taken the time to list and identify all the issues that short-term rentals, because that was supposed to be positioned as such. The cause, and we're spending time now, we're moving to ordinances. Well, if we don't know what we're trying to control, why are we talking about ordinances? So what are the issues that we need to solve? It's one of the questions that I have. And what are the positives? The economic impact of short-term rentals on this community is huge. I mean, if you go back, many of you haven't been here then, some of you have, but you go back 10 years, you didn't know what stores were going to open up the next year. We had a lot of vacant storefronts. As time has gone by, vacation rentals has increased. It's brought a lot of tourists that spend a lot of money here. And that is our #1 industry. So I think we also got to look at what are the issues. What are the positives? Let's list them. Where's the whiteboard? It's there. But someone needs to list that to start talking before we go into ordinances. I think that's off base to really start talking about ordinances before we know what the issues are. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room?
John Porzondik, 790 Lake Street. I couldn't agree more with this previous gentleman. Being here 21 years, we've seen a steady increase in our tourism. And he's right about the stores being closed and turning over, where now they seem to be more full more often. So we don't have a lot of empty stores like we used to have 10, 20 years ago. Also, if we put too many restrictions on home rentals, then you're inviting the big hotel chains to come in and occupy land that's still available on Blue Star Highway. And now you have an opposite effect where people who come to Saugatuck for a quaint little town and they want to see older buildings and whatnot, won't be coming back because they're really not interested in the Best Western or American Inn. I've had many guests at our place that want to know, where's the oldest building? Do I get a soda fountain treat, the way they used to and so on. So they're looking for not only B and Bs, but home rentals in the neighborhood. So I couldn't agree more with this gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? Okay, we'll take a look at the Zoom. Anybody on Zoom wish to make a comment on any of the agenda items? Trish?
Hey, good afternoon. First and foremost, I wanted to introduce myself to everyone. I listened to the meeting recording that was published. I was unable to make the last meeting, but it's a pleasure to meet everyone virtually. I've been very engaged in the conversation leading up to this point. I haven't put my name in the hat to be on the short-term rental task force, but I was very pleased to hear all the comments that were made at the last meeting. 3 points I want to make very quickly. I hope I can make my 3-minute allocation, but I have been in the Saugatuck area for about 5 years. We had a second home on the hill, bought it about 5 years ago, used it as a short-term rental, as well as a secondary home. We invested $200,000 into renovating it, brought non-compliant items up to code, did everything we need to try to keep the look and feel of that quaint cottage so we can really blend into the community. We take a lot of good care of that property. We kind of outgrew that space and we wanted to spend more time in Saugatuck. So we recently acquired 647 Butler Street, spent about $700,000 on it, and are in the process of spending about $400,000 renovating that property, abiding by all the historic district codes and regulations that we have to, making sure that we're keeping all the windows the same and all that kind of good stuff. And the reason I mentioned some of these numbers to you is we had anticipated being able to recoup some of that investment by short-term renting our home. And we had anticipated rental income to be able to recoup some of that massive investment that we made. We made a decision to invest in this community under the rules that are currently in place. And if these rules do change and we are unable to potentially use some of these properties that we have as short-term rentals, that would really severely financially impact me and my family. And I speak on behalf of not only myself, but I think of others that are investing heavily in this community as well, building new homes, renovating homes, and wanting to give other people that want to visit our community a safe place to stay and are visiting the city of Saugatuck. Changing rules and putting ordinances in place, while I agree are very, very needed, looking at potentially limiting might have a negative impact on the people that have decided to invest in this community and really stay for the long term. Second thing I really just want to mention is as I listen to the conversation and listening to McKenna, first and foremost, welcome to the community. I wish some of you had visited us more before this all happened. And welcome to the wonderful place that Saugatuck is. And I promise you're not going to slide downhill in the winter, is one of the comments I heard made. And I was a little concerned, though, at the comparison of our community to communities such as Park Township. I was concerned by not only the comment of a similar type of neighborhood, because it is a completely different type of neighborhood, but I was also more concerned as I did more research that they completely banned short-term rentals in their residential areas. That really concerned me, and I don't want us to be compared to places that aren't like us, knowing that we're a very unique community in our own right, and should be treated. I was actually enthused by Steve Mann's comments that we'll be treating the city of Saugatuck very individually overall. Final comment that I'd like to make is, am I over time? I will save it for the end.
Okay, thanks. Any other, and again, we're commenting on the agenda items. Any other Zoom comments?
Brian there.
Ryan?
Yes, so Brian Elmore, 985 Ridgeview. Just echo a lot of the comments that Thresh just made there. Certainly agree with, making sure that we're comparing apples to apples when we're doing our comparisons of communities and making sure that the uniqueness of Saugatuck is taken into consideration through all of that. One thing, just commenting about the ordinances which are specifically being reviewed today. I mean, we have existing ordinances. We've had existing ordinances, we've had existing process. What we haven't had is enforcement. We've had a lack of resources to be able to even enforce the ordinances that exist today. And oftentimes, I think the lack of enforcement has resulted in some of the pain points that the community has bubbled up around short-term rentals. So as we talk about any existing ordinances or the creation of new ones, I think we need to be mindful that unless we have the resources, we have enough, unless we have more fire department, responders, unless we have people in the, town hall that can actually respond to community reports of violations, et cetera, to get to the owners that, may either be available or kind of absent owners, and enforcing those bad behaviors before we kind of go down a path of making things even more restrictive. It's a little bit disappointing that we've gotten to a point that we've convened an entire task force and are spending city resources on external consultants when we don't even know what the impact would have been of enforcement of existing ordinances themselves. We may not actually be in this place right now if we had been policing things accordingly to the existing rules that are out there. But here we are, and I think there will be good that comes out of this, and good community input and good analysis and data. But feeling like we have to come to the end of this with some really significant change just because we've constructed this whole task force around it and spent money on doing this, I just don't know whether or not we'll get the impact that they're really looking for, and we may have really just create a lot of negative things around the devaluing of property, the destruction of people's investments, souring people on the community themselves. I've heard numerous people considering, selling their homes after this rental season, just because we don't know what the future holds, and we don't know what, the impact to our property values will be. So just wanted to, reinforce the fact that we really need to make sure that anything we're proposing or anything we're discussing comes along with it, the resources to actually follow up on that and enforce. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else on Zoom? Okay, we'll close the public comment. Moving to the review and discussion, Ryan is going to start with the and just for context of where we are in the process, we are really in the information gathering period. So we will have ample time and devote ample time to looking at the opportunities, the issues, concerns. What we're really trying to do, and Ryan and McKenna will be helping us with this today, is ground ourselves in where we are today so we know the starting point. Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, task force members, and very well said, Madam Chair. We wanted to give the task force kind of a baseline of where we're at before you kind of get in, so that way everybody's on the same page and the community's on the same page as far as what's on the books now before you kind of start discussing more detail about what maybe the potential issues and opportunities and concerns are. Towards the end of today's meeting, I think Kyle and Chris are going to go over some potential, upcoming meeting topics with you, and want your feedback on what things you want to make sure are covered, or issues or concerns you may have that we need to make sure and have a discussion about. In addition to looking at, what additional analysis, are you looking for? And so there's a list of options that were kind of provided in your packet. So we want some feedback from you on that during this meeting and next meeting, so we can make sure on the front end we're gathering all the data and information that you need to kind of wrestle with as you go through your evaluation. So again, just kind of to start with the baseline, I wanted to cover kind of what is our current short-term rental registration process. And some of this is going to overlap a little bit with what Chris and Kyle are going to talk with you about as far as what's in the ordinance. And I also kind of wanted to identify a couple things that or issues that maybe have come up that I've noticed, at least from a staff perspective. So I'll touch on those today. So every short-term rental unit in the city is required to essentially apply for a short-term rental certificate. And so that starts with an application, and your ordinance requires that certain things be in that application. Certainly we need the address and subject parcel of the dwelling unit. And I highlighted that for a specific reason because not every maybe rental in the city is required to have a short-term rental certificate, depending on the type of rental situation that it is. And so I'm going to kind of touch on that particular issue here in a second, where we've identified some problems at times when folks have applied. We need the name and contact information of the owner. The application requires that name and contact information of a local representative or rental agency that's within 45 miles of Saugatuck. Some folks maybe haven't been aware that we actually do have a limitation as far as how far away that local representative or local agent is required to be. On the application, the applicant's required to provide the proposed maximum occupancy. Again, that's not the final occupancy that they may be authorized to have. That happens to the inspection process. But we're getting a sense of at that point, what is the maybe owner see as a reasonable occupancy for that particular unit. And then every application is required, the ordinance says is required to be to have the owner signature. And so that owner is basically signing saying that they are going to operate the unit in conformance with all the applicable ordinance requirements. And so that's important because ultimately the owner is responsible for the short-term rental unit. So our short-term rental packet, that page you see on your left there is all the information that's required for your ordinance. And then in every application packet, there's the actual ordinance section from the zoning ordinance indicating, what is a short-term rental unit, what's required, kind of what's that process. So all that information is provided to the applicant up front. And then in every application packet is a copy of the rental inspection checklist from the fire department. So these are the things that the fire department is going to look for during their inspection. And so this helps the applicant ensure that they're meeting all the fire code requirements before the fire department comes out. Because if there's a reinspection that they have to do, there's additional costs that are involved. So that's in every application packet as well. So me as the zoning administrator, I'm tasked with processing short-term rental applications and certificates. So once I receive an application, I conduct an initial review. And so first thing I'm checking for is to make sure that the application is complete and has all the information that's required for the ordinance, right? That owner signature, that contact within 45 miles. I make sure that the fee is paid. Right now it's $350 to register for a short-term rental unit. And then I'm checking the application for zoning compliance. I'm taking a look at the zoning district that it's in to make sure that it's a permitted use in that district. I'm looking to see, some zoning districts, short-term rental units can only be on the second or third floor. There's also limitations on what can occur with an accessory dwelling unit. And I'm going to kind of touch on some issues that have arisen with those. And so I'm checking to make sure that the unit the applicant is looking to rent, at least from a zoning perspective, would be eligible to be short-term rented as long as it were to pass an inspection. And then there's some data entry involved. And so our computer system, we call it BSNA, I'm entering the actual owner, the representative and contact information is kept. We collect what their proposed occupancy was, and we also collect on the application and do data entry on the number of parking spaces that the applicant indicates that they have. So some common things that I have come across so far and processing these as the zoning administrator that have caused some issues. One is really the definition of a dwelling unit, because short-term rentals have to be in a dwelling unit. And as you can see from a rather lengthy definition, there's certain things that are not included in the definition of dwelling unit. So hotels, motels, bed and breakfast rooms, and inns are actually not included in the definition of a dwelling unit, and therefore wouldn't be required to obtain a short-term rental certificate. They're allowed to have a rental by nature of the use that they have. The other piece that we run into some issues with, especially as we've had bed and breakfast units convert to homes that would be used for short-term rentals, or situations where maybe somebody wants to install a accessory dwelling unit, is that a dwelling unit has to have independent cooking, bathing, and sleeping facilities. And I highlighted independent cooking there because we run into situations where somebody believes they have a short-term rental unit, but they only have a kitchenette. And the evaluation that we've done on what actually constitutes independent cooking and looking at, definitions from other communities. Our zoning ordinance doesn't clearly define that, but there's some interesting mortgage-related guidance as far as what constitutes independent cooking. And essentially, we've interpreted that to be something where you have some sort of stove or range or something along those lines, not simply a microwave, that you would actually have to have some sort of, not simply a hot plate, but some sort of, and they make them pretty small now. So there is the ability to put these in rather small units. But I point that out because that's an issue that's arisen, especially with accessory dwelling units, and then in some bed and breakfast situations, because a bed and breakfast unit that can't have independent cooking facilities. And so somebody that's wanting to then convert maybe, to a multiple family dwelling, if it's were to be allowed, and wants to rent separate units out, has had some challenges with that particular issue. The other thing that's pretty common throughout the community is folks want to construct or convert structures on their property into accessory dwelling units. And so rental of accessory dwelling units or using them as short-term rentals also has some limitations. And so staff and our attorneys have conducted a pretty extensive analysis on this over the last several months, but essentially an accessory dwelling unit can be rented under the same contract as a single family dwelling. So if you have a single family home and you have an accessory dwelling unit on the same property, both the accessory dwelling and the single family home can be rented together under one single contract. That's allowable. An accessory dwelling unit can be rented separately from the single family home as long as it's owner occupied by the fee owner and they receive special land use approval from the planning commission. So this would be a case where I'm a homeowner, I live in my home, I have an accessory dwelling unit. I would like to rent my accessory dwelling unit, just the accessory dwelling unit. In that case, they apply for special land use approval. The planning commission takes a look at it and makes sure that it meets the requirements in the ordinance. And if it does, then the planning commission grants approval, and then the homeowner then applies for a short-term rental certificate just for the ADU. The zoning ordinance actually prohibits renting out a single family dwelling and an ADU to separate properties. So you can't have a single family home and an accessory dwelling unit on the same property and rent them to separate parties. The zoning ordinance actually prohibits that. The other issue that we run across, and if anybody has questions as we're going along here, feel free. So
Save our questions till
Nope.
the end. or-
feel free to interrupt anytime, anytime. Yep.
If you don't mind me, just backing up to page 18 with the parking spaces.
Yep.
Are they required to have, parking spaces not on street parking spaces? Do they have to have parking spaces in their driveway or parking lot on their home?
Yeah, so Kyle and Chris are going to kind of touch on that essentially dwellings have to have 2 parking spaces on their property. But that's kind of the extent of it. Now, the exception to that, though, is there's certain zoning districts that have exemptions from parking requirements, and that includes essentially down here in your waterfront zoning districts.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, and just to clarify, hotels, motels, B&Bs and so forth, those dwelling numbers do not go against the total number of rentals that we've discussed, which we've talked somewhere between 25 and 30% of occupancy, correct?
Well, so the data that we have shouldn't include those units. I've come across some situations where like bed and breakfast units, were for some reason granted a short-term rental certificate, even though they're operating, so we've run across a few issues like that. So some of that may be in some of the data, but for the most part, no. It should be just dwelling units that are registered as short-term rentals.
So eventually we'll get some kind of separate that, because that obviously plays into the number of total rentals that are homes and so forth, right?
Yeah. And I would say we've cleaned up a lot of that. I mean, I'm not saying that there's not, I haven't gone through every address to check, to be quite frank at this point. That's something that certainly we have the ability to do. It would take some time, but yep, certainly I understand your point and wanted to make sure that we have, peer data. And I think another issue that's arisen is that, some of the, websites that are out there that kind of indicate the number of units that we have don't necessarily know the definition of a short-term rental unit, or, and so they're including maybe, hotel units or bed and breakfast units or, motor court units that are down the street or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding, like you were saying, like other websites. I know with Airbnb, VRBO, you can dwell down to a map basically.
Yep.
Because from coming from the vacation rental programs, There are people out there that are doing it themselves,
Mhm.
who have not gone through the fees, the regulations. So my question is for those people who are not considered like legal or registered, is there a way that somebody within, or our consulting firm that can kind of look at these? Because Airbnb basically doesn't really charge you a fee to be on their website. So
Mhm.
that's the most popular one
Mhm.
for people to go on to. And then VRBO charges a pretty hefty fee of like $500 to be listed.
Mm.
So, you can go in and look and see, okay, this hasn't been registered, this hasn't been registered. So I don't know if that's something that we could think about down the road to make sure that these people, whether they're just putting themselves out there on Airbnb, but are not following all the qualifications that are needed. First point. Second point, the 45-mile range, I
Mhm.
guess, how do you control that? I mean, could it be like a couple has a house, they live in Chicago, but they're gonna put their friend on the list, their neighbor?
Mhm.
Is that okay for that? Or it has to be something more of some type of like more significant, I guess,
So it says local representative or agent, and I don't, that's clearly defined. At least my view of it, unless you two, either one of you have a differing view as you've reviewed, things so far. So local representative could be a neighbor or a friend, somebody that can be contacted if there's issues. And to your first question, Kate White, that used to be our project coordinator here. She assisted the previous zoning administrator last summer. They went with they did a pretty extensive review, similar to what you've
Okay.
indicated, where they literally printed the listing on, the websites that are out there and went one by one trying to, now it's not always easy because they don't just list the address. You have to like cross-reference it to maps, and they can see the inside of a home, and it's hard to tell exactly which one's which. So it took quite a bit of time, but there's literally an investigations book that she developed that I still have actually referred back to it at times, where they actually went one by one and did find some that, a number of them that weren't registered, and then worked to bring them into compliance. So that was done, probably within the last year or so. Not to say that there's a benefit to doing another round of that, certainly.
Yeah.
Quick,
Go ahead.
Sorry,
No.
quick question.
Mhm.
And what are the consequences for somebody who doesn't register a short-term rental?
Mhm.
Are there?
Yes, there are. And in fact, the city council, probably last year, if I recall correctly, kind of established some separate investigation fees related to that. And there's actually a policy that's kind of been set out as far as how to handle violations and working to bring folks into compliance. So it kind of escalates in costs. And then a general violation of our zoning ordinance right now starts at $100 fine. But then there's an investigation fee on top of that the city council established. I think it starts at like $250 if they're not responding to letters and so that's where it starts. But then you get into, there's some other pieces with whether it's there's some language related to being, a violation every day that it's occurring, and you could actually stack, violations, although from a practical matter, does that, happen?
Maybe that might be something that we should discuss as a task force, that should be increased because $100 seems pretty light. Or something so significant that is taking a task force to address. And that can go to, $1,000 and, something I mean, because they're not following ordinances. But then that can go to maybe some of our resources, of things that we conclude for the task force.
And just that good comment. I just want to interject. What we're trying to do here, and Apollo, I'm sure you will agree, is just get everybody on the page as what the ordinances are. Ideas like that, put them in your notes.
Yeah.
Because after we get through what the ordinances are, then you talk about what the issues are, the positives are, the negatives are. Then we'll move to, okay, what is in the ordinance? What do we think we should be able to do? How would we regulate it? Those type of options.
Right.
So let's stay on top.
One other question, Ryan. How do we determine occupancy? And do we get to, I don't know if McKenna's going to cover that, but how do we determine that?
Yeah, so there's a national property maintenance code is what the fire department is using per the ordinance to make that determination. But so the fire department inspects for that and then advises me essentially at what the max occupancy should be based on that.
I got a question. Excuse me. So you made it sound like an STR on a residential home
Mhm.
is a different permit process, application process versus an STR on a piece of commercial property or a motel or can you explain that a little bit? Because I've got some that's considered a motor lodge. I got one that's considered commercial. So is a commercial building considered a dwelling if there's, does that follow the same rules as STR?
Mhm.
Which then would make me ask the question, are those considered in the STR numbers?
Right.
So, yep,
There's several different types and I just thought it'd be
Correct.
good to let everyone know what the different types are.
so if you have a dwelling unit inside of a mixed use building, say it's residential on the first floor and there's a dwelling unit above. Commercial zoning district, but the dwelling unit itself, yes, would have to be registered as a short-term rental. Motor court issues, hotels, motels, bed and breakfast, those are not registered, well, hotels, motels, bed and breakfast and inns are not registered, shouldn't be registered as short-term rental units.
Should or should not?
Should not.
Right.
Okay, but what about commercial on the first floor? And the residential on the second or third floor?
Right, so like I said, mixed use building that contains a dwelling unit, the dwelling unit itself meets the definition of a dwelling unit, has to be registered, would have to be registered as a short-term rental unit.
Say that again. I just got confused.
So a building like you just described would be a mixed use building. You have commercial on the first floor, but you have an apartment or a condo or whatever it is that's on that second or third floor. Second floor. That would be considered a dwelling unit and would have to be registered as a short-term rental unit, even though it may be in a commercial building. If you have a dwelling unit within a commercial building, it has to be registered as a short-term rental unit.
Okay, and then there's a different fee structure for a dwelling unit with a commercial on a piece of commercial property versus a dwelling unit on a piece of residential property?
No. Register your dwelling as a short-term rental unit. The cost is $350.
Okay.
So whether I have an apartment above one of these buildings down here that I'm going to rent out as a short-term rental unit, or I have a single family home up the hill, that cost to apply is the same
Is it per unit or per building?
for units,
For rental unit.
per dwelling unit.
Okay, 'cause I was under the understanding that there's a 3-year STR and there's a 1-year STR. And the 1 year applied to a commercial piece of property.
Nope.
Because I know I got the check stub, but I believe one of my commercial pieces of property yearly at $700. And it doesn't matter how many units it was. I'd have to double check that on my side. If you could double check, I might get myself in trouble here. now.
Does the zone play into this question or his question on where you are in the city?
Nope.
Limits?
No, so these are, the short-term rental regulations are under the general regulations. Now, each zoning districts has, lists whether it's a permitted use or not. And does have some limitation on whether they have to be on maybe the second or third floor in certain zoning districts. But the general regulations for short-term rentals is what we're essentially talking about right here. And that certificate would be good for 3 years. I've had some people apply sooner than that, and I've explained to them that they have a certificate that's valid for 3 years and they don't need to reapply.
Regarding the accessory dwelling units, so like, let's say there's a house on the property and then there's a garage and they've made it, they want to make it into an apartment to rent out.
Mhm.
Is there an additional fee for that or a different separate, like, and what was that? Is there that fee?
Right, so they would have separate fees in the sense that they would have to apply for zoning approval to have the accessory dwelling unit above the garage. And if they wanted to rent the accessory dwelling unit separate from the single family home and it was owner occupied, then they would have to go to the planning commission. So there's pretty significant fees to do that. So there's the zoning approval fees, and then there was the separate short-term rental registration certificate application fees.
And Ryan, just to clarify, an accessory dwelling unit and the primary dwelling unit cannot be rented separately,
Correct.
but
that's from a contractual point of view. I mean, somebody can come in and say, well, I'll pay the bill and we'll have two families and split it up, and there's no way to really regulate that though, is there? That's sorry.
Yeah, no, I think-
No,
We're getting down into
Yeah.
something with.
Yeah, I mean, the ordinance says it has to be under single contracts, you know, if two families are choosing to rent a property and they split the bill, I think that's probably a little different than the owner saying, here's one contract for you to rent this entire property.
I apologize, I digress. I
No,
just wanted to
that's-
understand.
that's good.
So
Good example. This is what we're here for.
only one permitted STR per residential parcel. Is that a fair thing to say? Actually, per parcel.
No, in the sense that, so here's the caveat to
Full
that.
Apartments, right? In the commercial.
Is
building.
each, even though the single family dwelling, and then this is another thing that we've evaluated with our attorneys, even though the single family dwelling and the accessory dwelling unit have to be rented under one contract, there's still two separate units because they each have to be inspected and have their own occupancy assigned to them. So they each have to be registered. The regulations said that to be rented, under a single contract. Yep.
Okay. Had an example where there's a house and then there's an apartment above a garage. So the old people that had it were actually renting them out completely separately. So we have worked with the homeowners, the new homeowners, and so those are now being rented out together under one contract. And the fire inspector did come through and he went through both the house as well as the other, and we were certified for that. So I don't know if that helps.
Yep, thank you.
Good question. This is why, so we want to get a baseline, make sure we're all working from the same information. The zoning issue that's arisen at certain points, especially in these waterfront zoning districts, is there's actually a restriction that says that short-term rental units have to be on like the second or third floor, which for the most part would make sense if you're looking at, you have retail on the first floor and then you have some dwelling units above in one building, but there are some circumstances where you have some homes that may be on the first floor in this particular zoning district, or some condos that have first and second floors and they're separate units, to where we've run into some issues with that as well. So if I'm reviewing an application, it meets zoning regulations, we have a complete application and it's they paid their fee, I then send a copy of the application to the fire department. And so they work on scheduling or contacting the owner or representative to schedule the inspection. They come out and do their inspection, which some of you probably know that process better than I do because you've been a part of it. And then the fire department will let me know if the unit passed or failed. If the unit fails inspection, then right now we charge an extra $100 for a reinspection. The city council's fee schedule requires that we charge for that because the fire department actually charges us to go back out and reinspect to make sure that the missing items were corrected. And then actually the ordinance states that I cannot actually issue a short-term rental certificate until the fire inspection has been completed and approved. So it's important that, and I try to stress this to folks if they don't know, that when they apply for a short-term rental certificate, just because you've applied, you cannot start using it until you've received your inspection. I've actually issued that short-term rental certificate. So once we get to the point where we've passed the fire department inspection, everything else is good zoning wise, I then take the occupancy that the fire department lists on their approval and I enter that into the BSNA software system. And then I issue a short-term rental certificate. And then a copy of that short-term rental certificate is then shared with the owner and the representative. And so there's kind of a copy of what that looks like. That kind of explains to them what that maximum occupancy is, how long the certificate is valid through. So it's good for 3 seasons. And then the other caveat that's kind of printed on the certificate of inspection and registration is that, there may be some private restrictions that are in place. Some maybe, condominium associations may have a restriction on short-term rentals of some sort. And ultimately, if the city's not a party to that particular agreement, then that's something that they need to make sure that they're following their own private restrictions that may be in place And so there's kind of a caveat on there that says that you need to make sure that you're compliant with any private restrictions that may be in place to your
I have a
particular.
question in
place.
South Haven. It's required that they put their certificate of inspection and registration in the front window, one of the front windows. Is that something that is required for us as a community?
That's not,
Not currently, okay.
that's not, so it'd be something that this group decides to recommend, so. And then after issuance, there's a few things that the property owner is responsible for. If there's any changes, as far as, who maybe the rental agency or representative is. If there's a change in mailing address for the owner, the owner's required to contact the city. If there's a change of ownership, that actually requires a new short-term rental application and certificate is what the zoning ordinance states. So it doesn't transfer to the new property owner when it's sold. There's a separate short-term rental application that's required. And then there's actually a piece of the zoning ordinance that has not historically been enforced, is my understanding, is that the property owner or rental agency, they shall commit a completed safety checklist to the city for the second or third year of the certificate cycle for the certificate to remain in good standing. And so that's not something that the city is historically enforced or collected. Certainly there's that initial inspection that the fire department goes through, but the city hasn't been collecting and people haven't been submitting an additional checklist every year to say, yep, I still have my fire extinguishers in good shape, or I still meet this requirement or that requirement. So I think that's something that we'll have to kind of flesh out as we go along and how we want to handle that going forward. So, all right, that was a lot. But thank you for your patience and good questions. And some of it will be some crossover, but I think Kyle and Chris are going to lead you along some good further discussions. So.
Thank you, guys. Madam Chair, if we may. Thank you again, task force members. I do have the pleasure to have Chris Corey here in attendance with us today, who was present last time via Zoom. So I'd like to again just welcome kind of Chris in attendance. I'm going to try to keep him seated to an extent due to his knee, so he's not up and down in that regard, but I'll defer to him. So again, we're here obviously for the task force meeting. As Ryan mentioned earlier, we want to try to provide the task force and the public at large more of an overview of the existing ordinances and regulations just for the city of Saugatuck itself. And then later in our presentation, we'll discuss community comparisons that's already been brought up. So topics of discussion for us today are going to include the existing short-term rental ordinance, which Ryan has already touched on, off-street parking requirements, nuisance ordinances, community comparisons, and then kind of looking ahead as well. So our short-term rental ordinance. And this is just a very brief overline bullet point here. It's not a deep dive into it. We wanted to provide you with the kind of the key highlights of it. Begins at section 154.022V, and then owner, as Ryan indicated, is to seek a permit for any period less than 30 days, meet all building, health, fire, and safety codes as expected by the township fire department. And then outdoor yard areas, open decks, and pools shall not produce excessive noise, odor, and external disturbances. And then single room rentals are not permitted. And this is all within the ordinance itself. In addition to this, tents, campers, temporary sleeping facilities are prohibited as a short-term rental. Certificates are valid for 3 seasons. Occupancy limited to National Property Maintenance Code, and then local resident within 45 miles of the boundaries of the city. It's already been a little bit asked about, but off-street parking requirements for this. We do have types within the zoning ordinance itself that talks about off-street parking requirements, and then the minimum number of spaces. For dwelling units within the city, 2 spaces are required. This does not take into account if you're a short-term rental or not, but for the district itself as a dwelling unit requires 2 off-street parking spaces. I'll defer to Ryan any additional time throughout here for any additional comments on the zoning ordinance. Questions on off-street parking? Floating houses also require 2 spaces as well. Right, on-street parking regulations. This goes into more of a brought up at the last meeting, kind of what are some of the offenses that could be considered. And then by looking at the offenses, it kind of helps us guide what the regulations are as well, such as parking too far from the curb, prohibited parking areas, obstructing traffic, parking within a fire lane, and so forth. I'm happy to read the list, but I think a lot of you already have it in front of you, so. Questions on street parking, that I might defer to Ryan and city council, if there's any questions on that. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I think there is.
Yes.
This isn't news to anyone in the room, I don't think, but I think this is one thing I want to make sure we point out on this slide. Stuff everywhere. All right. And that is that on-street overnight parking is permitted year-round except during specific plowing days, correct? Some communities have much stricter restrictions on on-street overnight parking. You guys do not. So that is something I think this test work will want to take into account, because a short-term rental that has more cars than the 2 that are required is going to generate parking on the street. Now, that parking is legal, right? But it's going to end up happening, and it's going to end up taking spaces that the neighboring residents won't be able to use. So that, again, we're not going to resolve that today or make any changes today, but I do think that's an important input when it comes to parking and our discussions going forward.
Thank you, Chris. Questions on parking or anything we've talked about so far?
Yeah, I guess. The other thing I would add, is to think about, related to the parking is, it's, and these guys certainly would be able, to identify, parking, whether or not this is a pretty 2 per dwelling unit is common or not. But I think when we start looking at short-term rental units, some of these homes can be rather large, and then we get in situations where there may be multiple families that are renting entire home and maybe bringing more than 2 cars versus maybe somebody that just happens to have a large home and they only need, 2 cars. So whether somebody is renting a smaller cottage that, only has 1 or, 2 bedrooms, well, 2 cars is probably fine. But when we're talking about the size of some of these short-term rental units, 2 vehicles, we're probably talking about more than 2 vehicles, and that's where we probably end up in situations where there's more than that, maybe on the street. So.
Yeah, to give some context about what's common elsewhere, your baseline rule of 2 spaces per unit, except downtown where it's exempt, that's pretty in line with most communities, right? Where we may want to have discussions going forward is that you don't have, as Kyle pointed out and Ryan pointed out, that there are no extra parking spaces required for short-term rentals. They are just treated like dwelling units, right? Which means downtown, they're exempt from parking requirements. And in the neighborhoods, they only have to provide 2 spaces regardless of the occupancy level. So again, not going to make those changes today, but something that you guys may want to consider looking at.
All right, further questions? We also looked at nuisances. Again, this is an overview of it within the ordinance, and it begins on or pertains to section 94.04 noise. We heard that was a concern at the last meeting from citizen comments regarding noise violations. And this ordinance regulates noise pertaining to construction, sound amplifiers, engine exhaust, radio, and music, shouting, whistling, and sirens in that regard. So there is provisions in the current city of Saugatuck ordinances regulating noise. And then I believe that is enforced by the sheriff's department.
Is there a time frame, like, 10 PM at night to 8 in the morning? No construction on weekend? I mean, is there any specifics on that we know of?
Better handle that one.
Sorry.
No, it's
a very good question.
I think 11 is the cutoff.
I think I would ask the question, does that mean anything in between the hours of 7 and 11 go, or are there limits?
There would be limits. It would be at the discretion too, probably of the enforcing officer. I mean, if you have this is probably not the place. We can definitely look into it further on that if there's questions directly related to this. I know Ryan's looking at it for us further. If you would like us to follow up, we can on this. I don't want to make any guesses or examples. So we can add it and then bring you back a feedback at the next meeting.
Well, I think as we, start to peel the onion, so to speak, on some of the issues that we're hearing from the community, we're going to find, I think, noise and nuisance being up near the top. And, speaking from personal experience, right? I mean, there are some homes that are relatively small and, you put 2-3 people in them and you're not going to have a problem. There's other homes where in my neighborhood, right, we've seen over 20 people in there and you get a constant noise throughout the day. Is it, people are laughing and joking and you can hear swearing and things like that, right? So they may fall within, if it falls within the legality of how the regulation is being written, I think it's something we should probably look at, because I think we're going to find a lot of the complaints are stemming from things like that. So it would be good to understand further.
In my experience, I think the definitions are always going to be gray. This is just being in this industry for as long as I have, there'll never be a foolproof way to mitigate everything. It's what can we do? And this is the primary reason I joined this board, is to get to the problem before it happens in the first place.
Yeah.
Preventative medicine, I call it, let's, contracts before they sign up to rent your property, what the ramifications are if you choose to break those, what your quiet hour, post it and just give them all the resources to be in line and be a good neighbor. Because what's loud to someone, it's going to be different to someone else. And then there's the whole tolerance level of this neighbor or that neighbor. And it's just, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, there's just no definition. It's that simple.
Well, and you can find that people's thresholds change, right? So the more they're subjected to disruptions, right, the less tolerant they're going to be. Right? So
we owe it as rental managers to meet the neighbors. That's one thing. Again, be proactive. Hey, we're going to be managing your property. Please let us know if there's any issues. We'll do all we can to, make sure that happen. That's just one example on what we can do, but we got to just identify things and prevent it from ever happening in the first place. Because is it foolproof? Heck no. Is there going to be issues? Absolutely. But can we minimize them? Absolutely.
I concur 100% with Kevin being in the property management program as well. Something that we've started doing is taking our company business cards, does have an emergency after hours number or office number, who to contact. We give them to the homeowners and we ask the homeowners who are renting to please give these to your neighbors. So if there is an issue, whether, we've gotten calls about kids screaming because they're jumping in a pool too loud. So that way, then we can, either call the guest or work with the neighbor and try to come up with a solution. And that's worked really, really well for us.
Yeah. Makes sense.
And they appreciate just being acknowledged that we're trying to be part of the solution and not dismissing who our neighbor is.
Yeah, and along those lines, we've talked, in fact, we just talked about it at lunch again today, that, I think, for a future meeting, we'll try to at least check with the sheriff's. They don't track things. My understanding is by like short-term rental unit. It's simply by address, but we can get a sense of at least how many calls, the sheriff's office has had related to noise or disturbances in the last few years. And one, that'll give us an overall number, but then we can kind of cross-reference some of those addresses to see if there are maybe, there's some sort of trend or a specific issue maybe with short-term rentals. Although certainly, not everybody that's maybe being bothered by noise is calling or comfortable calling law enforcement. And that, I think that's where some of those discussions come in amongst you task force members about, should there be requirements that, the local representative be posted or that information be provided to neighbors. So maybe that the neighbor may feel more comfortable just reaching out directly to the representative or the agency to maybe work on addressing that particular noise issue. But
Yeah.
something to think about as we're going.
It seems like communication is a big opportunity for us once we kind of know what we're doing, regardless of what does and doesn't change. If we, to owners, to neighbors, to everybody, just, talk about what the policies are, how we all want to be good neighbors. and here's what to do, that could go a long way. One, and just what are the requirements and what do you do if you have an issue? And that should help, I hope. Borrowing a page from Kevin.
All right. Community comparisons, that is a separate page in there. It begins on 40 of your packet. That's how it is. So, standalone. So what Chris and I would like to do with the task force, we briefly touched on it last meeting, is to kind of get an idea of, as we move forward in this process, what are other communities we should be looking into for regulations, potential concerns as well. We do acknowledge that, yes, there is no community like Saugatuck. We're not going to find a, apple to apple comparison, but we could find similar aspects enough that would be germane to us to review this. Chris, you want to talk more about your, a little bit about this?
So.
Sorry, not to make you get up.
So what we brought before you is kind of a overview of quite a few communities. How many you ended up with, Kyle? It was
13 or 14 communities are listed on here.
And with the kind of the question of, all right, which ones of these do you guys want to look into in more depth for ideas, comparisons, et cetera? Particularly on the issues that we're discussing, like the ones that have already come up, like nuisance, right? Because we don't think it's going to be a good use of this group's time to go through all of these, but we wanted to give you this overview with these kind of basic questions so that you can see the ones that you think might apply, whether the community is similar to Saugatuck or the regulations are similar to what you've got now or similar to what you think could be the right answer. And then there are a few that are, some of the more nearby communities. And obviously we go all over the state, but there's some that are more nearby, and some of their policies are having impact on you, right? Some of the more restrictive ones in the nearby, the Park Township was mentioned. City of Holland is very restrictive. The inability to do short-term rentals there is likely increasing the demand for them here, right? So it's another thing that's important for you guys to know as a task force. So what do you think? Do we want to kind of hit I don't know, what do you think? The key differences, Kyle, between some of these?
So what we put together internally, we talked about is just how do we even bring you a sense of comparison within the communities itself? Because if we give you a dozen or 20 communities to pick from, how do we measure any of their metrics to make it actually substantial to this conversation? Are they arbitrary? So our internal team came up with 6, 7 categories to help kind of give the task force an overview of what their regulations are in a broad sense. And then from there, we'd ask your input of what does the task force feel would be a good comparison, good community for us to look into further, to then dive more into these types of regulations or just in general their ordinance. Then we'll tie into later discussions we have here, but ideally we're looking for potentially six-ish communities to do a comparison of their regulations to then cross-reference that to the city of Saugatuck.
Is it possible to also include at some point the fees that they have to pay? Because like South Haven has 1-year certificate and it's $600 every year. So that might be helpful for us as well.
Fees and renewal terms.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I like that. That's a good idea.
I think also how many if we can find out how many short-term rentals they have and what the total dwelling units is so that we know what percentage short-term rentals are. I think
We can look into that. That data is going to be the availability of that data is going to be different depending on the community. Here in Saugatuck, that data is not that hard to get because you guys already have a robust registration program. And, maybe it's misses a few here and there, but it's pretty close as far as here's our list and this is the number. But we can try. And in some cases, we can say, look, there's a cap, right? So, Acme Township has a hard cap of 100. So we could say 100 out of what, and then we get your percentage that way.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think what's hard for us is, we hear, we think we're between 25 and 30%. And is that a big number or a small number? Or, I mean, we all know how it feels to us, but maybe within, Michigan towns similar to ours, it's kind of on par with others.
That's also why it's important that we do a better job defining that original question I had to see, because that number is probably a little inflated. If there's dwellings in there that aren't technically rent homes.
It might be about even because we know there's some that aren't registered. So but I do think it would be great if we can get whatever resources we need to support the city to really, let's get sort of our baseline data and have it be as accurate as it can be so that we know, going forward, we started with as clean a data as possible. And I know a lot of that might be manual and, we follow up with Ryan on what resources there are to help with that.
Ryan, would the CVB be a good resource? And I know Ashley's up there on the screen in terms of, we're all required to pay lodging tax as part of our rental process. And if there's dwellings out there that aren't paying lodging tax, they're obviously most likely not also technically registered. So it's maybe a good way to help find who's in and who's not. It's still 10 or more?
Yeah, and I think one of the charges of the task force was to look at fees. I think the city council has expressed an interest in looking at, fees or whether or not there's some sort of tax or what other options there may be in this regard. So I think question of fees, taxes, who's, has to pay what, I think is something that should be a future topic or at least something to discuss further. But certainly if the CVB has data that may help us, I'm more than willing to take a look at that. I know some of these other firms like Granicus and others, can, for cost, print me a list of everything that they at least have that from scraping different sites that are out there. And then it would be a matter of having to look at each one to determine, well, this one, wouldn't qualify because it's, a bed and breakfast unit. So this one wouldn't count towards our total or doesn't need to count towards our total. So,
Also, just to clarify, it is the Saugatuck Douglas, Benville, Glen. I mean, it's basically everywhere. Fee that the Visitor Bureau collects is 5%. And then there's obviously a 6% sales tax. But do the B&Bs and hotels, do they pay that 5%?
Not sure.
Can we let Ashley answer that one? I know she's on there. If she wants to unmute, she can probably answer those questions.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. So I was sorry, I was talking to Lisa while you were just asking, but I did hear Ann's question about do the B&Bs pay and the hotels pay the 5%? They do. Yes. And also the question about like Kevin Tringali wasn't a question, but he implied that the CVB might have a list of all the vacation rentals that collect the 5% lodging tax. We do not have that list. We could ask our members to provide us with a list, but we don't have one. Was there another question I missed?
And then Ashley, it was from the audience, but in general, when it comes to short-term rentals, do you only collect that based on up to 10 units, like a management company? You collect that from the management company or per unit?
Yep. So they're only required to collect that 5% lodging assessment or tax, for lack of better words, if they are members of the CVB. So we have a few vacation rental management companies that are members. So if it's a single Airbnb or VRBO property that is not a CVB member, they would not be required to collect the 5% tax and submit it to us.
Okay. Thanks, Ashley.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was good context. So there's a few things we want to look into: fees and renewal terms, percentage of housing stock that is short-term rentals. There's a few things that jumped out at us on this chart. Would you like us to go through? Okay. So, one of the first thing we looked at is what type of ordinance, right? You guys, this is currently a zoning ordinance. The difference between doing a zoning ordinance and doing a general or police power ordinance is a little nuanced, but can be important in that zoning ordinances have to do with the use of land, and by state law, if a zoning ordinance is adopted and you were doing something previous to that legally, that after the adoption of that zoning ordinance is now illegal, you are allowed to legally continue doing that, right? That's a principle of zoning. Doesn't necessarily have to be true under a police power ordinance. So something to think of when you're thinking about change to your ordinances here. And potentially something reassuring, right? Interestingly to us, as we look through these different communities, it was actually more likely that short-term rental regulations were under a general or police power ordinance and not under zoning. And there are certain things that you can't regulate via zoning that you can regulate via police power ordinance, right? And in some ways, some of the nuisance stuff that we talked about is under that. The other thing that kind of jumped out at us, we looked at, are there hard unit caps? Something you don't have right now. And some communities have gone with very aggressively, right? Acme Township, hard cap of 100. Yeah, sorry. Do you have a question?
Chris, just so that I'm clear as we proceed forward. If we ever looked at it and we were making zoning changes.
Yeah.
Anything that was currently in the zoning would be grandfathered. So for the people in the community that say, that they shouldn't be affected, that would be one way that we would possibly go to consider. You could have zoning changes, but anybody who's currently legal would remain
So
legal as long as they own it.
there is a complexity to this, which is specific to your ordinance because you guys have a 3-year license term. And I'll defer to Ryan on the specifics of that, but the 3-year license term throws a little bit of a wrench in that.
Meaning that's, excuse me.
Yes, it does. So right now, the zoning ordinance states that your short-term rental certificate, it's good for 3 years. And then after 3 years, we're evaluating your application based on the zoning that's in place at that time. So
That's helpful.
that's a little different than, okay, I have, zoning approval, or I can do this under the zoning ordinance that was in place at the time. And then there's a separate licensing process outside of the zoning ordinance. So yeah, that's a pretty significant, I think, I won't call it a nuance, but a pretty significant thing that we'll have to talk through and probably work pretty closely with our attorneys on, is to make sure that we consider that. I don't want to put him on the spot today. I see he's on. I won't put him on the spot on that because I think it's a greater analysis that's involved with that.
And again, that's jumping way ahead, but when some people, when they say, oh, you guys are necessarily, as I'm writing things down, I was trying to make note of, would that be an option that should be discussed a month from now when we start talking options?
Yep.
And if it would help too for the task force benefit, if we get to any stage of any kind of recommendation, Chris and I and our team, we're working with staff, we'll try to do we'll say a simplified flow chart potentially as well, working with the city attorney of, okay, if we change this, here's what will change throughout the rest of it, or here what other impacts it could have. So that way we're not saying, yes, let's throw in a cap number here and then just forget about it, walk away. We'll want to do a deeper analysis for you and help present a clear picture, whether that be graphics, text, however that happens, to say, okay, we put a cap on it. Now this is what will impact that. And here's how the process would look like in 3 to 5 years by doing, option A or option B, or recommendation A and B. So that helps too. So that helps.
And then it's one other question on the zoning side of it. I don't know if you've seen it. Some communities were looking at having different short-term rental requirements per their zones. Right now, ours is just one ordinance, one requirement across the entire city. Have you seen anybody else in this comparison?
Yes. Yeah, a couple of examples of that. St. Ignace, which is the top of the second page, has a hard cap, but the cap only applies within residential districts. So if your short-term rental is not in a residential district, then you are exempt from the cap, right? Sutton's Bay does as well, but they're up at 150, so it's a little higher cap. And City of Holland also has a cap within residential districts, it's actually 25. Very low. They have a number of things that exempt you from that cap. Being owner occupied exempts you from that cap. So if the owner is living in the home and just renting part of the home, that's exempt from the cap. And not being outside a residential district is exempt from the cap. And they have a free for all during tulip time. They have a 10-day period every year when there are no rules on short-term rentals, which is kind of funny. But that one I think is something that you guys should be aware of, because that hard cap of 25 outside of those exceptions, I mean, that's a city of 35,000 people. You're a city of 900 people, and they have 25 and you have 200 plus. So that's their local decision to make. But we're talking about a market. It's impactful. So
They do that
yeah,
by
that's-
zoning or by general ordinance.
and that's by that theirs is
Combination of
the
both.
cap is in zoning. The rules on the behavior of tenants and things like that are in general ordinance for them. And of course, there are other things that you can do by zoning district, and some communities do, like, well, actually what you guys have, which is you have no parking requirement downtown, right? And that applies to everything downtown, but it applies to short-term rentals as well. There are some communities that do, like, you know, they have housing density, right, by zoning district, and that will impact your short-term rentals as well. We have seen, I think Park Township again came up, you know, they said short-term rentals cannot be in residential districts at all. That's very aggressive, but again, they just did that by zoning districts. So there's all sorts of things you can use your districts for.
So as we're talking about this and we're talking about ordinances and changes or not changes or anything, have you guys as a, you know, a consulting firm gone to a city and gone through all of this process and determined that, wow, they had a pretty good program? We, you know, we could make a few changes, but we could choose that program is pretty good. And I just wanted to bring that up now because the more you talk about the word change, it heightens up the anxiety of everybody and what's going on. And I was just curious, you know, have you ever had it that, hey, wow, they got a pretty good program?
Yeah, that's happened on this topic and others to us. I mean, we're here to help you guys have your discussion and make your decision. And if ultimately the recommendation of this task force is don't change anything, it's fine. I mean, we're not going to be upset about that. And it's very possible that if you guys, as we move forward, say, all right, McKenna, what is your recommendation? Or give us a couple of options. One of them might be, here's your zero change option. Don't change anything. Or maybe all you'll do is change the fees or something like that. That's all very possible. And that's, I guess that's the sausage making process, right? You might just decide, nah, actually, we're okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's important to stress, I mean, I agree with you, Sean, when we say change, it indicates a bias to change. But that bias to change might be, well, why don't we enforce the ordinances we have? And I don't get the sense from this committee that anybody is locked into, and I hope not, because we don't know enough yet to contemplate change, I don't think so.
Yeah, we're very early in this process yet.
Then Sean, too, if it would help, going through this process more, even with looking at community comparisons and hearing so far the concerns that the task force has had and the residents, we want to present you with information of what's working and maybe not working in other communities. So that way, when the task force does get to a stage for any or no recommendations, you have had, you know, ample comparisons available to you. Like Chris said, we're not here to say, yes, here's the 10 recommendations you need to get to. We're here to work with you and facilitate this in the sense of, okay, we understand that there is short-term rentals need to be looked at further within the city. And then this is the process to do that. You know, what's other communities working on, what is working for us, what's not working for us. You know, if there's something's not working for us, how do we modify that to be more in line? If that is, it ends up being, you know, with enforcement actions, okay, that's then the recommendation potentially the task force makes, but we want to present you with enough information that you guys feel confident in moving forward with anything.
Yep.
So Chris, is what you're looking for is for us to talk about which of these cities, these communities we want more information about. And I guess I would also ask you if you have a point of view of what given what you know about us and, sort of how we're structured, our, size, the kind of community we are, if you have a recommendation from that as well.
So yeah, our original intention today was to say, you guys pick 2 to 4 of these and we'll get the entire ordinance in front of you, et cetera, and you can really dive into it, which obviously we can do. Though, if you would prefer to keep things at this level and say, all right, get us more information like on the fees. Or on the percentage of the housing or something like that. Then we could continue doing it that way as well and just sort of add more columns to the chart as we go. We're comfortable doing that as well. But yes, our initial, our initial thought process was let's get a broad array and then we'll dive in. As far as places that are most similar to you in terms of their community character and also in terms of their regulations, that's actually kind of interesting because there's a few that I would have thought, that's probably going to be similar to Saugatuck, and they really didn't come out that way. Charlevoix is a good example of that. I think they're a fairly similar community to you in terms of their character, but their rules are quite different. They have a pretty hard cap. They have this concept of a business unit versus a personal unit, which maybe some of you guys want to look at, but where if it's rented out more than 28 days per year, that's a business unit. And if it's less than 28 days, they call it a personal unit when there's a lot fewer restrictions. So, and you guys don't have anything like that in your ordinance. So that ordinance, I would say, is not similar to yours, even a similar community. I think Grand Haven is bigger than you guys, but has pretty similar system. It's under their general ordinance, but it's a registration system like yours. You say 45 miles, they say 60 miles. They've got a little kind of a proto tenant code of conduct they require to be posted. You guys don't have that. We discussed that. But they don't have some of the other things that you also don't have, like separation distances and extra parking requirements and things like that. Some communities do. Yeah.
I have a question. Did you guys think about South Haven by chance? Because they've just kind of gone through an overhaul of what we're looking at right now. They put I believe they did a lottery for new certificates. They very strict off-street parking. So I was just wondering if
We could pull the South Haven stuff. The South Haven has had, as you probably know better than I do, a long and tortured history.
Yeah,
on this
yeah.
Topic.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And from an outsider's perspective, it feels like every time you turn around, South Haven is trying out some new idea,
Mhm.
right?
Oh, yeah.
Or a group of South Haven residents is petitioning the
Oh, yeah.
legislature to take all this away from locals entirely, right? That also happened. So, but we can absolutely pull their most recent version and add that to the chart.
Thank you.
We also included in here too, City of Ann Arbor, even though they're not a resort community in the sense of Saugatuck is, but with U of M right there and people coming in for football games or other collegiate athletics, we thought it might be germane enough to the task force to still do a more inland comparison, but that would have a big impact on short-term rentals. So again, it's not apples to apples, but we wanted to try to provide enough of a discretionary review that we could look at samples in that regard. So that's why Ann Arbor's in here too, just because they do have a large collegiate, athletic programs. People travel from all over the region to come see football games. I mean, their stadium's packed 80,000 plus people every time. So, visitors are going in there to see, doing a short-term rental. So that's why that one is in here too.
Chris and Kyle, one, I like this whole thing because I think what it does, it'd be like Ann here, who's like circling everything, saying for the future, I want to bring this topic up. I want to bring this topic up, which I think is great because that's hopefully what we're all trying to do here. I'll just speak, for myself. I think the cities, when we're narrowing it down, at least once when I look at this list, I see like Charlevoix, Grand Haven, St. Ignace, Sutton Bay, places where they really are very reliant on tourism with very little other industry that they have the ability to kind of draw upon. And also, when I just kind of quickly look at those, they each have something that's a little different in their current ordinances as to how they're approaching it. So that's just, I'm just throwing that out. If there are other people have different ideas, I'll share with that if you're looking from my input.
Also, I was
think
wondering,
it's,
where's Clay Township?
Over by Detroit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Come here for it.
We wanted to really throw out as many as we could that
It seems to me, and there's been, some topic on the public comments, right, that, at some point in time, I think we're going to drive down and start identifying the issues we're hearing from our community. Obviously, some of these cities have dealt with similar issues, right? And not to get too formal about it, but it seems to me we want to first get to a point of really, let's prioritize what we think the number one concerns are of the public. And then maybe we can look through this list and try and map, okay, it looks like this town, maybe we validate, that this was one of the top problems that they were trying to solve. And we look at it that way and say, okay, we can whiteboard it and say, here's one option, right? And then we can drill it down a little, maybe tailor things to, I don't want to get too far down the process, into a process. I'm sure you guys have more experience at it, but
Well, and Mr. Chair, as Chris mentioned too, we're happy to take this kind of table and then as topics come up, add to it overview. And even if we keep it broad in a sense like this, instead of diving into a, specific ordinance regulations initially, we're amenable to that too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I like that idea. I mean, because we, as we sort of scoped our involvement here, we left the community engagement side very open-ended, but also tried to, it's extremely important. Right. And so if that may be, if maybe you guys want to start talking about, let's have a community forum, open house type thing and try to identify, okay, what are the key issues that came up in public comment, right, at the beginning of this meeting, and then say, all right, what are the 3 or 4 things other communities have, yeah, there you go. Okay, yeah, Kyle points out to me that we want to get into that at the next meeting. But yes, it's important because I like that process, right?
So
Of saying, here's what we need to get at, here's what some of our peers have done on that issue. that
Yeah.
Maybe you guys haven't.
Correct. So that's a good lead in. I just found this as a resource that ties into what you're talking about. And this came from Muskegon, apples and oranges in terms of who they are, who we are. But it was a simple online survey to the entire community that talked about everything we're talking about. So I think the way they presented it to the community is gonna involve a greater sample size.
Mhm.
And with that, my question, and I apologize for not knowing this yet, but I was at the infamous or famous transparency meeting a couple months ago that kind of just stirred this all up. And there was a survey that was out, correct? Which kind of something like, I heard like 6% of,
It was the end of the year survey.
Okay. And there was a small sample there that brought this to light, correct?
Right.
Was that, were the issues specific or was it, I think, like we're talking about all this, but to this point, I still don't know what the why is or what the what is. Was that mentioned in this survey?
Yeah, those comments were provided to both the planning commission, certainly in the city council's, strategic planning meeting packet. And I want to say we included it in a subsequent meeting because folks were asking about it. But yeah, there was the actual comments that were provided and the concerns that were listed. Yeah, we had those physical narratives. The clerk put it in a nice, format. So
It was
they provided that to you.
also, short-term rentals was also a big topic in the candidate forum for the city council last year. So I know you guys were asked several questions about that. So I want to keep an eye on the clock and make sure we allow time for comments at the end. So in terms of next steps on the towns, should we circle a few? I mean, I think Steve pointed out, and I think there's wisdom to that, towns that are similar to ours that are really dependent on tourism and don't have a lot of other economic drivers. And it sounded like Charlevoix, Sutton's Bay definitely would fit into that. And then if we want to throw in for the initial look, a Grand Haven or something, and then maybe people can give more thought to the others. I think it would be interesting for us to actually look at cities that have different approaches than ours, so that even if they're structured very differently, I think that'd be helpful for us to learn, but at least start with, communities that are demographically and economically similar, and then maybe give more thought to other ones we'd want to dig in deeper to.
So
Does that,
Madam Chair, I agree with that. One of the things I would guess I'd be curious, do you know how many of these cities had any type of a formal task force or a community board that reviewed their policies before they made changes? Because again, like to Joe's point, and we've been saying this at Planning Commission, I know council said it, we're not looking to try to recreate the wheel here and start at ground zero, because hundreds of communities across the country have been doing exactly what we're doing. And, so like I'm aware, like we've read the Sutton Bay one and I've seen the Charlevoix one, so I know for certain that, in theirs, and this is where we can get that commonality, because they always start off just like ours will probably very soon, start listing, what are the issues, what are the negatives, what are the positives. I've read through probably 6 of them. 90% of the things that get listed in one community are the same in the next community and the next community. I mean, ours will be somewhat unique on some of the, where we are as far as our size of a community. But I'm just curious, if any of those have had similar task force, we may want to identify those, because let's just pull in, some where they were, and then we can start with that as a foundation.
Above and beyond like the planning commission, right? It's everyone has that.
I think South Haven had a group that was involved. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, they did.
South Haven.
Yeah, I also
They
know,
had a
I
committee.
believe Grand Haven did.
I know Chickaming did, though, as you can see, Chickaming's ended up swinging pretty hard in the live and let live direction.
And we made.
But process wise, they created a task force. But I think a lot of them have run through their planning commissions. That said, that's ends up being, that's just that group, right? This
Right.
group has intentionally different representation. And I think that's good.
Well, and for everybody who's on the committee, I think we just said this at the start, the reason why we didn't run it just through the planning commission is that it would limit us, and like some of the things we're talking about as far as enforcement and fees, that's not underneath the realm of the planning commission. So the task force is so that they can look at it in its entirety.
Okay, so do we have a consensus that we'll move on a couple of these cities when you come back, and then we'll probably come back and want to look at some others in more detail, so like 2 or 3 at the next meeting?
Yeah, so here's what I'm understanding, just to make sure we're on the, all everyone's on the same page. You guys want a deeper look at Charlevoix, Grand Haven, St. Ignace, and Sutton's Bay. We want to add South Haven to this generalized chart. We want to add a column for fees and renewal. We have renewal terms, I guess, but for some of these, with fees for sure, we want to add as a column. And then as a separate piece of analysis, we want to, and maybe it's a column here, we want to look at the percentage of housing stock in each of these. That's a short-term rental.
Sounds good.
So
Yeah,
that's
great.
a good task list for us.
Yep.
I will say, because of the inconsistent data, we'll bring you as many percentage of housing stocks as
Yep.
we can, and then we'll keep kind of efforting that.
Yeah,
And
I think
that's gonna be its own
this will
thing.
be an iterative process, so we aren't. We
I'm
won't
sorry,
let the perfect get in our way.
I have one last question, and I know we're time constrained, so I'll stop after this, but at the risk of adding another column, I'm not trying to do that, but do any of these communities, have they looked at actual density caps within the units, or in other words, capping the number of people within any one, other than the codes?
Yeah, I was said, you guys do that, right? You use the property maintenance code to do that. I think there are a couple. Yeah, like Clay Township, you're not allowed to do a short-term rental if your home has more than 4 bedrooms. And Pentwater, you're not allowed to do a short-term rental if your home has more than 5 bedrooms.
Over those amounts?
Yeah,
or-
over those
Okay,
amounts.
got it.
So like, which I think is to try to protect against occupancy. right?
Yep.
So so there's that's out there. But yeah, most communities in our experience use fire code or property maintenance or something.
Okay.
That's objective and they didn't develop. And goes to goes to the regulations that we have on all dwelling units, right? In terms of things like a bedroom has a window. That's a building code requirement. And then the number of people per bedrooms in a dwelling unit is also listed in the building code. So these things are regulated whether it's short-term rental or not. And using your short-term rental ordinance to refer to them could be effective. And it is
Yeah.
very common.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you hear a lot of talk about noise and garbage and parking and everything, and you'd probably find a common denominator, right? It's going to be correlation to the number of people that are in it within one unit. So I'm just curious how they were, if they were looking at that and addressing it. So thanks.
Could you, again, not to do another column, but there are some of these communities that are now coming up with trash ordinances. I know I keep referring to South Haven, but we have 80 properties in our management program in South Haven, so I'm quite aware of what's going there. They are now, because of trash issues, fining the homeowners regarding trash. So I don't know if that's something that as a group we're interested in that or not. I don't know.
I don't know if it's an issue.
Yeah.
Nobody's really brought it up as an issue,
When we
but
get to that point and start, I think, whiteboarding out what we're hearing,
Yeah.
maybe, but yeah.
Okay, so do you want us to add a column on that or you want to hold off?
Hold on.
I don't think it's necessary. I was just curious.
Yeah, we can dive into it if we need to.
Okay, are we ready to move on to I think we wanted to wrap up with a discussion of the upcoming meeting topics.
You want to cover what's on there and then I'll talk about the analysis.
Yep, so we have initially internally and then working with staff and Holly as a chair kind of try to get an idea. And Jamie, this is, I think, page 38 of the packet. So go up on it. Yep. Yep. So working through kind of, I know at the last meeting we asked, it was asked to kind of have just a overview as meetings come up of what we're looking at. So community analysis, probably just after talking about this, we'll refine more into that spreadsheet we have, shorten that down. So that'll change a little bit. Code enforcement analysis, as Ryan mentioned, if we can work with the sheriff's department just to kind of get an overview, we'll pull that. National practices, that was more for us to look at, what is going on nationally in that, what are some best practices for short-term rentals? We can continue to add that or move that maybe till the June 15th one. We'll serve at that pleasure of the task force. And then I know Holly asked about survey questions as well, because as we get into the summer months, we need to develop a public outreach program as well, look at questions. So that was asked to include for the June 1st meeting. And then the 15th, just continue to look at short-term rentals first, the master plan for Saugatuck, further community analysis, and then zoning district overviews. And again, this is all just floating, we'll say, out there and it can be changed at the discretion of the task force.
One thing we might do, I know there's some desire to get at some of the issues, opportunities, questions and concerns. Maybe each of the task force members in the next week can, sort of do a grid of those and provide that data maybe to Ryan and me, and we can aggregate it so that we can come to the meeting with people's input on that. So we can show some momentum at capturing. And then I think that too, we want to keep as a living document that we can update as we deliberate more and think more. And then as we get the survey information back, we'll want to marry those together. Ryan, what do you think about that?
I think that's a good idea. Yeah, if the task force members want to share your initial thoughts, concerns, opportunities in a list form that we can put together in a document to then share with the full group. And I think, my thought to the task force and to McKenna is maybe that what I'm hearing is that we want to obviously make sure and get those kind of issues and concerns and opportunities out on the table. So maybe we push national practices up to some future meetings and replace that with a task force discussion of issues, concerns, and opportunities that you have up front.
Yeah.
And then we still want to have, I think, some further discussion with the task force about maybe must-have study up front. So some of that's in your packet today to kind of take a look at a list of additional things that we can study up front. There's some costs to those things that we'll have to work with the city council on potentially approving. It would be up to them ultimately. But, there's been some conversation, for example, of, can we get some like economic data? So we want to make sure, McKenna really wants to make sure that everybody's in agreement on what study is needed up front. So that way we're not months down the road and then, well, how come we didn't look at that or this? We want to make sure that we're planning on that up front. So I think maybe we'll make that an agenda item for your next meeting. So that way we can have all that fleshed out a little bit better and be, make sure everyone's on the same page.
I think that's great. So maybe the
Madam Chair,
focus, just to recap, so we'll do the further analysis, which would capture needs around economic data. we'll look at the survey. I do think we need to spend some time on the kind of information we want to gather from the community, as well as, what kind of ways we want to do that. We definitely want to get to those two. And then if we can review our thoughts to date on, where we see the issues, opportunities, concerns. Steve?
Yeah, I think to me, listing out the issues, I definitely think that should be, in my opinion, kind of like where we go next. As we're going through the ordinances and that, because then you start thinking, okay, if that's an issue, is it being addressed currently? What are some ideas? But also the reason for the issues, because we're going to bring the issues as we hear them from the community. But we need to know what the issues that we believe they are the issues. If we're going to develop a survey, so you can start asking, kind of like how Muskegon did. And they were trying to ask about if it's perceived that noise is an issue, then we could ask the community if they think it is. So it's kind of, I think having that list, but then also I've got positive and negatives and also, and remembering, just like we heard in some of the general comments at the opening, there are a lot of positives to, what we're doing in the community and what has historically been done here. So we want to make certain that we have list of
Right.
pros and cons, because anything that we discuss moving forward to address something on what may be a negative side could affect the positives. And does what you gain on one side outweigh, the negative you do to the other side, so.
Madam Chair, if I might, on page 44 of your packets, it begins kind of that a data analysis and a breakdown. And so what I'm encapsulating from the task force is, as we talk about these positives and not so positives, if we do that maybe at the forefront, and then work on your survey from that discussion next, and then from the survey, we would dive into the kind of additional data analysis at the next meeting, seeking recommendations to then be made to council for any additional supporting background research would be needed. If that would be a good layout of the June 1st meeting.
Right. And if you guys, McKenna, if you have examples of surveys and other, I know you've provided a broad overview in your presentation to us, but as you get to know us, what your thoughts and recommendations are, and if you have best practice examples of survey questions and stuff. I mean, it was great to get these questions from Kevin. No need for us to reinvent the wheel. We can.
Sure. And then as far as the data economic analysis stuff goes, there are 7 ideas in the packet, right, that we provided, and that we intended this to be something you guys could mix, match, decide what you think is important, what's not. You want to bring up something that's not on the list, we could talk about that too. And then we'll try to be upfront about, is the data going to be readily available, and how reliable you think the methodology is. And it doesn't necessarily, if we're a little iffy on those things, doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't proceed with the analysis. We should just then understand the reliability of the results, right? I'm pretty confident in the 7 that we provided, but we can come up with ideas on how to get at other questions as well.
Great. Okay. Anything else before we move on? I think the only communications we had, I included some notes. I met with a couple people in the last few weeks. So typed up my notes and those were in the packet. And similarly, if you do have lengthy conversations with people and take notes, it's always, feel free to share those or not.
Madam Chair, if I might one more time.
Yes.
Page 39 of your packet, we did take the zoning designations and overlaid the short-term rental numbers into a map for the task force to get an idea of where those rentals are taking place and in what district. These numbers were, I think, as of April from Ryan, and then as more come in, we can continue to work with staff to refine that, but we thought it'd be prudent to provide the task force with a zoning map with the overlay of the short-term rentals, so you can understand where those are taking place at.
I think Elizabeth asked.
Yeah, thanks.
Great.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah, so, I've looked over the list and there's some on here that, let's say 842 Lake Street. It doesn't give the individual unit numbers. So I know one of them in that at 842 Lake Street sold a couple years ago, still listed. as the owners who sold it. So I don't know where you want us to take that information to, or if there's, you know, when they have multiple addresses, if they can list the apartment number, something like that to make it a little bit more clear.
Yeah, I mean, we can provide like, addresses in our system, you know, vary. A lot of it's also broken down by like the parcel number that it's attached to, and the parcel number will kind of correspond to the unit number. So I'm happy to provide, you know, parcel unit data, to parse that out a little bit more. Yeah, part of that's probably just the way our system is set up. If you're aware of any particular issues, you know, if somebody has a short-term rental certificate and you know, sells the unit and they don't tell us, you know, then you know, it stays active in our system. So and then maybe the next owner either doesn't know they need a short-term rental certificate, and that's where it's kind of, we work to bring them into compliance, and that's an enforcement piece.
Yeah, but unless you're looking at that extended, you know, if you're just looking at the address, you might easily miss it too, right? If somebody else applies for a short-term rental with the same unit and there's multiple with that same address.
No, everything's, yeah, so our system tracks everything by address and parcel number. So I could see the history of, so if somebody were to apply and already have an active short-term rental certificate, they would apply, I would enter it in, it would put it in a hold status, and then once that new short-term rental certificate is issued, it closes out the other one.
So is there one certificate per parcel number? Or if
Dwelling
there's an
unit.
accessory dwelling, then there could be two.
Correct.
Okay, why don't we get to the public comment? So again, 3 minutes. We'll start with folks in the room, and this is really anything you wish to share. So come on up to the podium, and if you can give your name and say where you're from.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick Barna. I live up on Francis Street, and I've been there a while. And the only reason I'm here, quite frankly, and to me, it's the elephant in the room. It's the noise and the lack of civility of the people that are occupying these rentals. It's just ridiculous. And I appreciate everybody getting together to organize how the business is going to be run and all of that. And that I have no argument with, but to me, it's overacting. It's not reacting to what I think is my big concern is the fact that sometimes it gets really crazy up there. And you know, it's probably hard to believe, but I have a 12-year-old daughter, and she hates swearing, and you know, you hear it all the time, and that really bothers me. And but anyway, that's really all I have to say, is that I think we need to get together collectively, decide penalties and enforcement on how this is going to be controlled. You know, without that, nothing's going to get done. And I have nothing against anybody renting their home. I just want them to do it right and have strict controls, and $100 fine is a slap on the wrist to what these people are making. And it's got to at least be like $1,000, and maybe after a couple of incidents, they've lost their license for that year, their permission. That's really all I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Laura Godfrey, you're on the right track, and I appreciate the work. It's a lot to dig in because, as we know, we let this go too long, too far. And I'm really glad to not hear the word transparency. So thank you for that. I'm happy to hear that on the list of cities, you're going to look at other communities, not necessarily the ones that mimic Saugatuck. That's going to give you, I think, a very narrow range. I think you're looking for a long-term outcome. What's been successful long-term? Which communities have held in place for the long term? I think that's important. I think credit to the Objective consultants. As a consultant, I think that's a really great position to be in. Earlier, we heard a story of investment, and I'm getting a little tired of hearing about investment. I've made a large investment in the community. You were making that investment in the community because Saugatuck has been porous on rentals. You came in, invested because you knew you could rent it, not necessarily because you were embedding yourself and committing yourself to the community. So I just want to counterbalance that, because I'm not jiving on that. The other thing I love to hear is this notion of communication. You'll hand me a card. If I have a problem, I'll get up in the middle of the night and fumble around for that card to make a call. No, you guys fix it, tighten it up. As a neighbor and a long-term person here, I don't want to have that burden. That's not going to be on me. So I think there's some tight work here to do. I'm really grateful for all of your time and your perspective and your thought, because I know we're going to get it right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marguerite Zamolo and I live at 520 Grand Street up on the hill. So I also want to say thank you for this group getting together and really committing so much time and energy to the seriousness of this issue, because it is really an issue. My family has owned the house at 520 Grand for we're coming up on 100 years in a couple of years. And in all that time that we came back and forth or lived in Saugatuck, because we have lived in Saugatuck multiple times, and I'm living there now, I've never seen an issue, anybody in my family, up until the last couple of years with all the Airbnbs. And I can't live there anymore. I'll just say it. I'm exhausted. All summer long, I'm waking up. I've never had to call the police. We've always known all our neighbors. I remember all the neighbors that lived in the neighborhood all the way back to when I was a kid, even the ones that are gone and deceased. People had a sense of community because it was a residential area. It wasn't a commercial area. It wasn't a business zone. It was a residential zone. And, yes, there are neighbors that make noise at times. Yes, there are people that have parties at times, but it wasn't constant. And I guess for what I really struggle with as somebody that loves Saugatuck, and I won't even go to what extent I love this place, which is why I'm living here. But for me, the real challenge is what all three of us have just said on the noise, because you may be a homeowner that has it and uses it as a rental. And you could be a conscious person and want to be fair to the neighbors. But at the end of the day, the people that are in those rentals, they don't own it. They have no accountability to the people around in the neighborhood. And I don't know how you resolve it. I mean, I kind of agree with the first gentleman who said it's got to be really severe, but even then, for me, I struggle with it. So my only other question is, when you look at the number of rentals that you're going to allow, if that becomes part of the discussion, is please just don't look at the number for all of Saugatuck. Also look at the concentration, because up on the hill, there's a really high concentration and it's tough. It really is tough. So that's all. I really appreciate you digging in on it, and I wish you much success. This is an extraordinary place to live. So thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Hi, Angela Canal, Spear Street. Is the information that you have in your packet available to us? Like, could we go to the library, or where can we find this information?
Yeah, it's online. If you go to the city's website.
So everything that's in your packet is on the city's website. Okay. And the other thing I was wondering, when you're looking at other communities, maybe go outside of Michigan to places like Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, which are more upscale communities, and what they've done. I mean, they have the exact same kinds of problems, I think, and they are tourist related places. And it might be interesting to see what some places outside of Michigan have done. Thank you.
Thank you.
John Porzondik, 790 Lake Street. So I love columns and I love the grid on the communities, but I think what we're missing out on, and I haven't heard much of this, is the business aspect of what we're discussing, because we are basically, our tourism relies on our business. I do not own a business here, but I do have rentals. I'd like to see a column that says, do they have docks? Do they have is it a boating community? How many parks do they have downtown? How many ice cream parlors? I think we have like 12 or 13 in this little area here. Do they have trails? Do they have a beach? Do they have, do they have attractions and so on? So I think that might narrow your what if and allow us as interested parties to do, sort by, give me the top N number of, whatever. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out that I think we're missing a business component to match up against people because Saugatuck is nowhere near Clay Township. Saugatuck is more, I want to say, liberal and opening, and Clay Township is more purple, more the other side. So, we're bringing in politics here. So let's face it, Clay Township, we're talking Algonac and those parts. So not, and the only reason I know about that is because my sister lives up there. So just some things to contemplate. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else in the room? Yep.
Diana Decker, up Elizabeth Street. I agree with Nick. The noise on the parking. Sometimes I come home and I don't have a parking space. There with the streets and everything going on. I want to thank, the task force. I'm glad that the city appointed a task force to assist the city of Saugatuck. I owe apology. I felt that, okay, when I heard other people that don't live in the city of Saugatuck was going to be on the task force, I thought, how would they understand what we are going through? And then I apologize. You have very good questions, Anne. Your dad was an excellent township supervisor. Mr. Steele, you own a business, and properties here. So yeah, I think it's great addition to the task force. The violations, I think that's probably enforcement is gonna probably be a big one. And so that's what I'm just gonna say for right now, because you have many months of your task force. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Hi, Peter Hansen, 441 Spear Street. I read the transcript of what I said last time, and I want to apologize. I was spoken gibberish when reading it, so it was probably hard to follow. There are just some comments from listening today. I think the thing that I'm struck by are the number of people who are considering selling their homes and leaving Saugatuck because of the short-term rental issues. And when you look at the population of Saugatuck from 2020 census, 2000 census to 2020, we've lost 20% of our population. And from hearing from comments from neighbors and from reading letters that were part of the package today, there are people who have sold their homes and have moved away from Saugatuck because they were tired of the noise surrounding them. I think one of the main reasons we're here is because of that survey. The citizens of the community are saying SDRs are a problem for us. And so we've come together and hopefully we can come up with some solutions that will help both sides of this. I heard that, the downtown, the business community has succeeded dramatically. And so that is because of STRs. And I'm not sure that's entirely true. I've been here 16 years, moved here at the start of the big recession. And I think that downtown Saugatuck, there has been very, very few vacancies in the commercial district during that time period. We still have some of that today. I mean, you look at Toulouse, that property has been vacant for how long? So I'm not sure that SDRs are driving that issue. Last time I heard Joe and Steve, in looking at that map, they were concerned that they hadn't captured all the STRs on that map. And I would look forward to hearing if there's been any additions because of that. How does a neighbor contact the person? I know Ann brought up handing out cards to, I for one would love to have one. We had a unit next to us that held up to 20 people. And they were having the all-night fire pit outside. And we wanted to call the Saugatuck Police Department when we had a police department and there was no answer. I don't think most people are going to call 911 over a noise issue because that noise can come and it can go. And by the time you get a sheriff's deputy, I'm sure it's probably a fairly low priority that noise could dissipate. Last but not least, I think of the mailman trying to deliver mail up on the hill when we're busy, or a garbage man trying to pick up garbage. And I think it's almost impossible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Publishers that we never published last year. Only when the extreme 1 in the morning where I was kind of anymore, I think I called this year. Every single time the sheriff's department came out, they were fantastic.
Thank you. Anybody else in the room?
Jim Bauk, I live on Spear Street. Number one, you've got a difficult job to do, and I thank you for stepping up to it. It's never easy on these committees. I wanted to respond to a couple of things that I heard today was that the city doesn't have the resources to enforce the ordinances. I completely disagree with that. We have the resources. My background is manufacturing, and when you have a problem, you have to separate, is it an ability problem or is it an attitude or a will problem? The city has the money to hire somebody to help Ryan, who is just working himself to the bone. We could hire a summer intern, a college student, second year, third year, fourth year, who's in community planning, somebody out of Michigan State, somebody who could come in here tomorrow and start working on enforcement. And so the city has the resources. We just lack the will. It's time to think about that. Number two, as for calling the sheriff, we have a rental home directly next to us. It's advertised as Sleeping 10. When my grandchildren are here, it's difficult to hear the people in that unit sitting on the porch after they've hit as many bars as they can hit all day, recounting their adventures as if it was the Westminster Dog Show. And it doesn't matter if it's a bridal party or a bridegroom party or whoever, group of fishermen, whoever. It's a residential area. We need to know that we're renting properties in a residential area where people live. I mean, we heard from people today who said, well, I can't afford my house. I have to rent it out to make some money. Well, anytime you make an investment, there's a risk. That's their problem. I'm someone who spent a boatload of money because I wanted to live here. And my neighbors have done that, and their neighbors have done that, and the people at the end of the street are doing that. If you come on Upper Spear Street, you'll see people have spent a boatload of money to create a nice community, and it's our neighbors that keep us here. It's not the rentals. So what I would like to see is I would like to see this committee at some point in time have an open session with registered voters only. Let the registered voters come and talk. Let the people tell you, the community residents, what it is they think of this situation, and don't limit them to 3 minutes. Give them time to talk. Thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else in the room? Okay, let's go to Zoom. Looks like Lou has your hand up.
My hand is up.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you for only giving me 3 minutes, because otherwise I could babble on for about an hour here. I don't envy you your problems, your task, because short-term rental is really not just a Saugatuck problem or Michigan problem. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Lou. Yeah, you need to introduce yourself. I'm sorry.
That's what I did. Lou Wessel. I'm at 346 Mary Street, corner of Mary and St. Joseph. And as I said last time, I am surrounded by short-term rentals. And let me speak to a second to that map that was just put up as stars for short-term rentals. I saw at least 4 that are missing, maybe 5, and someone from the town is welcome to come up and walk around with me if they would like me to point them out. But my problem isn't per se the short-term rentals. My problem is the behavior of people. And I think you've heard that from many of your speakers. And I was at a get-together last night with probably 40 to 50 people on the Hill, and short-term rental was not the reason we all met. It was for community, but there were lots of discussions about short-term rentals. And they didn't focus on the number of short-term rentals or the caps that we're talking about. They all focused on behavior. And that's what I would, well, first of all, as far as your process, I do hope that you're going to do an extensive survey if what you have already isn't adequate. Instead of a community meeting, well, in addition to a community meeting, you've got a professional consultant. I hope they will do at least one focus group, maybe 2 or 3, because that's, I think, where you're going to elicit real consensus of ideas, as opposed to who can speak the loudest and the most passionate. And then once we've identified what really are the problems, and I do think that most of the angst here isn't about the numbers, it's about the behavior. But once we identify that, then we can go out to other communities here, Michigan, across the country, internationally, and look for solutions to those problems. A comment on a couple of things I heard that I thought were great is preventative. I was clearly hearing from a very responsible rental agent who meets with her people, her renters, tells them exactly what's expected of them. I assume there's something posted in the home. I've gone to many verbos where I've had a come to Jesus meeting before the renting started, saying you can, you cannot, you can, et cetera. And we knew exactly what the expectations are. I think that's wonderful. You have a website, you have the information on all the short-term rental properties. I would love to see posted on your website the name of the contact person and the number. That seems to me like would be a fairly easy way to have direct contact. And then what Hilton Head Island just did, where I was from, is they have on their website a big button you can push for a complaint headline, a complaint landline. So anyway, thank you for the 3 minutes.
Thank you. Looks like Doug. You introduce yourself.
Hello, Doug Rodewald, 413 Hoffman Street. Thank you for the time, and thank you for everyone for doing this. One quick observation for all the success we share and say the short-term rentals bring to Saugatuck. Here we always talk about Tuesdays where you can't get a pizza delivered. And I was in the pharmacy earlier this week, and a woman who was here for, I don't know what she was here for, but she was checking out, and she was commenting about how there was no place but Burger King to go get breakfast on Tuesday morning. You have Uncommon Ground, but Pennyroll's not open, a lot of the restaurants aren't open. I share that because I think that is a direct implication when you start seeing a town focused on the renters and on tourist season, and there's not enough community here to support restaurants year round. And honestly, the community is not generating enough young kids to actually work in those restaurants. Because a lot of times it's not about demand, right? It's about filling the jobs. So just wanted to share those 2 things. The other thing that we heard, or I heard I was really happy about, was the focus on occupancy. We're next to a short-term rental up here, one of the few ones that has a pool on the hill. And last weekend, there was 8 cars there. The prior owners sold the house at a price they probably thought was a little bit under market because they knew what the occupancy was and they couldn't put it online because the downstairs basement doesn't have any windows, doesn't have an easement, doesn't have a way out. But yet we know that that house has probably 2 more bunk rooms down there. So that house is basically every single time it's rented over the stated occupancy. So I would love to talk and hear a little bit more about the enforcement on those type of items. If there's going to be short-term rentals, great. We were a short-term renter at some point. I think everyone on the Hill has participated in the industry. We're not against it. It's about making sure that there can be a community here that can support restaurants and all the commercial activities year round week around, as well as enforce all those activities. The other thing I'll just say with the short time left is the noise ordinance was written, and you can talk to a lot of long-term locals here, in support of the businesses downtown. It's super loose. We had issues with a business downtown where we would call the police. We met with the owners of the restaurant. There's not much that the police can do. There's not much that the city can do with the noise ordinance. They can shut it down, but what are we going to do when there's actually issues? I think those are the type of ordinances. There has to be ramifications if people continue to break these ordinances. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else on?
Brian up there, you can't see his hand.
Okay, Brian.
Sorry, it does blend in there, doesn't it? Brian Elmore, 985 Ridgeview. Thank you, everybody, for the robust discussion and dialogue today. Just a couple things that I thought of coming out of that discussion around specifically the comparative cities. I would love to see more economic demographics about those in the chart itself. Things like overall annual budget versus number of residents or homes or properties. Percentage of the budget that's paid for by non-homestead versus homestead taxpayers, police, fire, and enforcement support and infrastructure for those comparative cities. Do they have their own local police department? Are they, sharing it with another community, et cetera? And economic details of the comparative cities, highlighting any industries other than tourism. I mean, I know I saw Holland on there and things like that. I mean, Holland has tons of industry, and I thought it was a little bit entertaining that during their one biggest tourism time of the year, basically it's no rules whatsoever. So even though they have very restrictive policies around short-term rentals, when it comes down to having it impact their tourism, they don't seem to mind it in that perspective. Another thing really is just around community input. I know that there's been lots of discussion on residents versus non-residents versus whatever. We are a community that is a blended community of people who, well, I'm not a registered voter in the city of Saugatuck, but I spend over half the year there, enjoying our home that we love and a community we love, et cetera. So I think it's a little bit insulting to some of us that are saying, they don't want us in the room, when realistically, just because you have to choose, one place to call your actual residence doesn't mean that we're not heavily impacted by the decisions the city makes and the policies, et cetera. And last thing, I just want to make sure that as we're looking at, the short-term rental specific rules and ordinances, that we take a broad, brush to what other things in the city might impact some of the things that people hear as pain points. I hear about trash, quite often. I don't know whether it's a big issue or not, but things like the recycling frequency that, we've locked into with Republic in the city, once a month to pick up recycling is not enough during the, peak season of tourism, when you have people that are coming through in these short-term rentals, et cetera. So either we're expecting them not to recycle, which seems irresponsible, or we are, putting them in a situation where we're just asking for overflow of trash and recycling. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Lou, your hand is up. Did we hear from you already? Okay. Anybody else on Zoom? Okay, I think that wraps up public comments. Any quick comments from the task force before we wrap up? Great. A motion to adjourn.
I'll make the motion.
Joe, a second? All in favor?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.